Sometimes fathers feel despair, like everybody else. And they say things they only think they mean in the moment. But with time, they learn that they never really meant it at all.
I think the thing that really makes Guillermo Del Toro's Pinocchio so special is that it's not technically about Pinocchio. I mean, it is, obviously, but he is more the lens that we see the film through rather than the primary character we're exploring. Really, it's about fathers. It's about Geppetto and Conte Volpe and the Podesta, and even about Mussolini as a kind of national father for Italy at the time. Even about God. Our focus is directed less towards understanding Pinocchio than seeing this world through his eyes. His pine eyes, and trying our best to make sense of it.
Well, you must try your best, and that's the best anybody can do.
We'll get into exactly what I mean by that, but first I think we have to start with another point, something from the original Pinocchio story that Guillermo del Toro completely flips on its head, so let's get into that. So the thing about Pinocchio as a story is that it was written by Carlo Collodi in the late 1800s, kind of as a moralistic lesson for children. This story about the puppet Pinocchio who's badly behaved, lazy, selfish, rude, whatever else. He has to learn the value of hard work, education, respecting and obeying his elders. Through his adventures, he learns to become a well-behaved boy and earns his transformation into a real human. But that's not this film. Not even remotely, because yes, the Pinocchio we see here is badly behaved, rude, mischievous, does whatever he thinks to do.
But I don't want to! I want hot chocolate!
And yes, he becomes less so by the film's conclusion. However, at no point does he need to unquestionably obey his elders. It's the total opposite of what Pinocchio needs to do. As much as Geppetto and Sebastian and Volpe and even the Podesta tell him to obey, really what children need is to learn to think for themselves. And as a children's therapist, that's a message I agree with so passionately. It's not to say either that obeying our elders, or in this case our fathers, is never a good thing. Obviously it is. There are times we need to trust the judgment of others. Sometimes that's even part of how we learn to form our own judgments. But the problem with the whole idea of good children need to do what they're told kind of thinking is that when you stretch that idea out far enough, you get to good citizens need to do as they're told, and then you get messages like free thinkers are dangerous.
Obviously the puppet is quite a dissident. An independent thinker, I'd say.
You end up in the sort of place that this film is set. Italy under the leadership of the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini. In Obeying Our Fathers, I think you get people like the character of Candlewick, a boy whose father wants him to be a good Italian soldier, wants his son to believe that real men don't fear death and will give their lives for their leader, who calls his son weak and as thin as the wick of a candle, for which this boy tries harder and harder, desperate to live up to this expectation his father has set, when really he'll never achieve it, no matter how good he might be. It would mean giving up his whole life and everything he is or could be, trying to fulfill something that he never can. It's the same with this monkey Spazzatura, performer in Count Volpe's circus, who obeys to a fault, and yet he too never rises above the name Volpe has given him, Spazzatura, meaning garbage, trash. He could be so much more than that, but sadly not in Volpe's eyes. What he needs to do then isn't obey, it's rebel or break away, same as Candlewick, same as Pinocchio. You know, it's really, really important to the point of this story that Pinocchio is a bit of an annoying, mischievous dick. However, that doesn't mean Pinocchio is bad, it just means he's young and inexperienced, yet to learn much of life, and that's okay, because he's genuinely good at heart. He tries his best, which I think is perhaps the wonderful thing we get about this version of Jiminy Cricket, here renamed to Sebastian J. Cricket. He as this figure of moral conscience who pretty much fails in his mission to advise Pinocchio. But that's fine, because, as he puts it,
because he was good!
Because Pinocchio never stops trying. Turns out Pinocchio taught Sebastian the true value of his own motto.
Well, I tried my best, and that's the best anyone can do. Pinocchio taught me that. I mean, I taught it to him, and then he taught it straight back at me!
This phrase goes from being something the self-indulgent Sebastian J. Cricket, the writer, the raconteur, something he says because he thinks it makes him sound profound,
That's rather clever, isn't it?
now turning into something that he fully believes. He learns and changes from someone only willing to help because he's promised fame and fortune into someone wanting to help because he cares, because it's right to. Sebastian J. Cricket has an important role here, but Pinocchio didn't need Sebastian to tell him what to do all the time, to teach him to obey and follow orders. What Pinocchio needed was to try and figure out for himself what is right to do in any given situation, and to keep trying to figure it out. Sometimes he'll get it wrong, but as long as he keeps trying, as long as he does genuinely try his best, then he will be as good as any of us ever can be. It's just I spend the vast majority of my job working with children who have been made to feel like they're bad, evil, horrible, useless people or whatever. None of them are, no more than Candlewick is weak or Spazzatura is garbage. Children are often taught to feel deep shame for the times they don't do as they're told, and this film speaks to that so beautifully. I love it. But that's just one half of it. I said it was about fathers, so what about them then? We're going to get right into that just after I derail this whole video to talk for a quick moment about World Anvil. Hello world! Have you heard of World Anvil? World? Sponsoring this video. World Anvil is an online tool for world building, character creation, campaign building and playing in all of these games, planning and writing your stories, and possibly some other stuff. I just use it for my novel, but it does other stuff too. World building can be difficult, you know. I used to use a folder for different Word documents which seemed simple enough to begin with until things get complex and you end up with a disorganized mess and you suddenly wish you had hyperlinks to different characters or mythologies in your notes. Or imagine this, say you want to design your own calendar for your world. You can pop in all the information, have the calendar generated, then build a timeline of historical events linked to that calendar or several calendars with all sorts of hyperlinks you might want sprawling to other articles, and then upload a map and link different events to locations on the map so you can easily see where and when everything happened. I find that so handy, and if the timeline affects how the map looks, such as a big city getting destroyed or whatever else, you can add altered maps to reflect those changes. And there are other tools as well. This is just the one I find most exciting, especially when it is all surprisingly easy to set up. In all my use of World Anvil so far, I haven't ever bothered to watch any of their tutorials on how to do stuff. I've just got on with it. I have a link in the description and as a pinned comment with the code TREE, which offers you 40% off all their subscriptions. There are different levels and you can even try out the free version initially, so give it a whirl, take it for a test drive. World Anvil. Now me back to talking other things. So I don't think it's spoilers to say Pinocchio here is born straight out of grief. Geppetto's beloved 10-year-old son Carlo was killed when a bomb fell during the First World War, for which Geppetto fell into a perpetual grief. Years later, in a night of drunken rage, he carves this puppet to be Carlo, to be his son. So yeah, he sets about creating a puppet that he wants to be like Carlo, and ironically Pinocchio is neither of those things. For some reason it took me until noticing that to realise just how phenomenally perfect the metaphor of a puppet is for this movie, because the thing about puppets is that they are controlled by a puppet master, someone holding the strings. Pinocchio doesn't have any strings and is controlled by no one.
If he's a puppet, where are his strings?
Who controls you, wooden boy?
Of course I control him.
Who controls you?
People try to control him, sure. Geppetto and Volpe and the Podesta, they do in moments, but not indefinitely, because Pinocchio is not their object. He is his own independent person. And I don't need to labour again how this metaphor relates to everything I said above about obeying and fascism and all of that. I think that's probably quite clear. But the point I'm getting to now is that a big part of what makes a child so special is that you can't control them, that they sometimes challenge you, they make you think, and often you even learn from them, that they pull you and your life in directions you didn't expect it to be pulled in. Yes, that can be scary as hell and difficult as hell, but it can also be exciting and wonderful, meaningful. Geppetto wants Pinocchio to be exactly like his first son Carlo, to carve away and control anything about him that isn't like Carlo, but he can't do that. And it's out of that conflict, a parent trying to control his son and a son trying to challenge or break free of his father, that they both find their way forwards. I just think it adds an extra layer to the message here, because this could be a very straightforward message. It could just be that parents shouldn't try to control their children. Geppetto has to learn to let Pinocchio be himself, as he does learn by the end of the film.
Don't be Carlo, or anyone else. Be exactly who you are.
And it's a very satisfying moment, but the problem with that message is that, well, they do. Parents do endlessly try to control their children. Not always control everything, but they have hopes about who they want this child of theirs to become, what they fear they might become, what they fear could happen, how they themselves will be as a parent. All of these feelings, and you know why they have them? Because parents are human. Of course they have hopes and fears, ones that aren't always perfect. Parents are just as flawed as anybody else. Which, when I say it like that, is painfully obvious, but in another way, especially for children, it can be a massive revelation to really think on. Troubled by the fine mess Pinocchio gets them into, Geppetto exclaims,
You are such a burden.
to which Pinocchio talks to Sebastian about it, who reassures him.
Sometimes fathers feel despair, like everybody else. And they say things they only think they mean in the moment.
Which is a wonderful line, my second favourite line from this film, I think. In a way, it's hard for me to say anything more than that. Parents let us down, inevitably. For all sorts of reasons, quite simply because they are just as imperfect as we are and will ever be. Doesn't make them horrible people either, you know, the extremes to how we are let down can vary immensely depending on our situations, I should stress that. But the message then isn't just that parents shouldn't try to make their children obey all the time, it's also that we can kind of forgive our parents for trying to. Again, how much you're willing or able to forgive a parent depends a lot on your circumstances, but as much as Geppetto accepts Pinocchio here for who he is, Pinocchio learns to accept Geppetto as a caring but also imperfect father. A lesson ideally all of us get to learn someday. I think we know it consciously, but sometimes it can take years before we reconcile the little kid within us that held our parents to a high standard based on our natural needs at the time, reconciling that with the reality of what our parents were able to provide. It's a lot to reconcile. This film, in a large way, feels like Guillermo's own attempt to try and do that. Parents, of course, try to control us at times, try to encourage us, push us in certain directions, restrict us in others. Sometimes they do it really well for the best of us, sometimes they get it completely wrong. And they have to initially, because a baby or a little kid doesn't have much agency to think for themselves, obviously, but also ideally some of the parents' control does draw back as we age, and at the same time some of the parents' hopes or worries or visions for the future of this child draw back too. You know, at first Geppetto's entire view of Pinocchio is coloured by his desires for another Carlo, possible guilt about the idea of replacing him too, and it takes time for him to see Pinocchio as someone separate from those feelings. It's all a slow process they're going through together, of Pinocchio learning to be independent and Geppetto learning how to let him go. In part, anyway. It's not until much later they have to properly let go. I think about Geppetto calling Pinocchio a burden, and I think it's unfair for him to say that, also not very nice, but I also think it's kind of true. Of course, having a child is a burden, or a duty, responsibility is probably a better word. That's not necessarily a bad thing, it's one side of it, and it also reminds me of this line.
You did bring me joy. Such terrible, terrible joy.
A very interesting phrase, both the terror and joy of loving something that you might lose. I suppose I'm saying, as much as children may bring you terrible, terrible joy, they might also bring you a wonderful, wonderful burden. And it's weird, I haven't even talked about death. If a child being independent, you know, not being this object you control, if that is a big part of what makes a child special, then unfortunately the fact you can't hold on to them comes into that as well. The fact you might lose them. We often hear the message that
the one thing that makes human life precious and meaningful, you see,
is how brief it is.
It's not always easy to reflect on the truth of that statement, though. This film does make me reflect on it. I'm not going to get into what exactly, but I think that's enough here. Other things to say before I stop talking. I love how suitably Italian this adaptation is. Pinocchio is an Italian story, so yeah, they don't have all Italian accents, but the locations look Italian, they say phrases, all the signage, names and things. I really like most of the music. The performances are all solid. Obviously, the stop motion animation is absolutely beautiful and so essential to this story. All the symbolism around puppetry would not land even half as well if it wasn't stop motion. Really, I only have one complaint, and that's that this film isn't long enough. It's still 2 hours long, and the cost of animating with stop motion no doubt restricted a lot of the runtime, but it does mean there are moments that just feel slightly rushed in this film. A little more time for the characters to sit with the moments they're in and to feel the emotion before we charge ahead again. I think it's because of this that the middle section loses some of its power here. Like, in just about 7 minutes, we jump from Candlewick standing up to his father to Pinocchio being hit with a bomb, almost burned at the stake, Spazzatura standing up to his father figure, sailing off, being swallowed by a dogfish and reuniting with Geppetto and Sebastian, dwelling on the sorrow of being trapped in a whale and then realising how to escape. It's too much. We need time to feel what the characters think about all of this stuff, what they've learned from it, how it changes them. Just some sense of emotion, really. You know, as much as there is this great thematic thread where Pinocchio tries to be like Carlo to win his father's approval, but it doesn't work, so he tries to earn money for him, but that doesn't work. So he becomes a good Italian soldier like society expects, but that all goes wrong, and he both experiences and helps his two friends stand up to their own father figures, so Pinocchio learns to accept himself as he is, and hopes his father can see the merit in that, which Geppetto then does for his own reasons of growth. You know, as solid an idea as that is, because there's no time for Pinocchio to reflect too much on any of these encounters, we don't exactly feel this change going on throughout the film. It just sort of happens at the end. And unless you look closely, it can make the middle section of this film feel like stuff just happening without any purpose or meaning particularly. But I still absolutely adore this. I only saw it this morning, no idea why I didn't see it when it first came out, but yeah. Let me know what you think. Comment your thoughts, good or bad, subscribe for other stuff, support me on Patreon maybe. Thank you again to Wild Anvil, but other than that, the only thing to finish with is my favourite line of the film, which is also the final line, the perfect line to end on.
What happens, happens. And then, we are gone.
And as ever, a special thank you goes to Janice McMahon, Luke Core, Treat Chukaba, Michael Gallagher, In Squares, Flying Spider, Samara Salsi, Joshua C. Folliet and Chad Bramwell. Thank you.